Welcome to Pablo Torre Finds Out. I am Pablo Torre, and today we're going to find out what this sound is.
Listen, don't threaten me with that. Look at his background. I like Cody's background better than Uggs.
You don't like the
Uggs
wood shades? You don't like the wood shades?
That's the best you got for $60 million. You got wood shades.
Hey, we're budgeting over here. Budgeting.
Can you get in front of your World Series jersey?
That's right, dog. That's in a safety deposit box. Safety deposit box.
He went for the money, Cody. You went for love and fame and World Series and LCS MVPs. You're welcome, by the way.
That's right.
Gosh.
Thank you.
It's the nicest gift I ever gave you.
That's the truth.
Getting rid of your ass.
You know, you really embody this team, what it's all about. I mean, Florida didn't want you. They put you on waivers. This team put a claim in on you, and here you are, the NLCS MVP.
Yeah, I can't thank the Giants enough for giving me the opportunity to come over.
For $1.
For $1.
It was $1. It was a waiver claim, and the Giants called us after they claimed him and said, you're not going to let him go to us, right? We were just blocking him from going to any of our competitors. And we were like, we're not paying Cody the rest of the year. We're letting him go. Larry Baer called the commissioner to try to interject because they didn't want to take on his money. And we were like, sorry, if you're going to play the game of trying to block your competitors from getting the player, you have to risk taking the player. And we called Cody into the office and said, Cody, love you, man, but you've been claimed by the Giants. Go speak to the traveling secretary because you're getting on a plane.
It's your ass out.
We had cleaned out his locker. We had done everything.
I want to explain one of the craziest rituals, processes in sports to people that have no idea what it is. And in the course of doing that, we will learn about your relationship. But I do want to just establish some basics. So at the beginning here, because there are now 3 voices that are not mine on this episode, could you say your name, when you played for the Marlins, and maybe an adjective that best describes your former boss, David Samson?
My name is Dan Uggla. I tell everybody that comes in here, this is the house that David and Jeffrey Loria built. They're like, David who? I was like, David Samson. They're like, oh, I know who that is. Yeah. Outspoken is actually a very good adjective, but, for lack of a better vocabulary, that's kind of what I'm going with right now.
Cody Ross played for the Marlins from 2006 to 2010. First of all, Dan, you're making me dizzy, bro. You're like moving around.
I know.
I had too much wine last night, maybe. I don't know, but you gotta stay still for a second. You're so fidgety.
Let me get a. I know.
I was gonna say,
do you have an office?
I do have an office.
Do you have an office in your 15,000 square foot house?
Here we go. Let me get some. I need a place to put this thing.
Jeez Louise.
Here we go.
I remember my first Zoom.
Yeah, it's horrible. All right. It's so unprepared. Here we go.
That's what Josh Johnson did. Hanley's homered and triple. Dan Uggla, did you? His name is Dan Uggla. Wow.
There's the guy I drafted in fantasy baseball. There he is.
Anyways, back to me. So 2006, 2010, never really got an opportunity at the first few places that I was at. And then got to the Marlins and had an incredible opportunity. I remember being with the Dodgers in spring training in 2006, and I was just praying. I'm like, please, let me go to the Marlins. I see what they're doing over there. They're young and they're enthusiastic. And so I guess I always say this to people about David. I say he's the second best president I've ever had in my life. All right. This is where
Who's
you
the
ask the question.
first?
Everybody else is tied for first.
I always was honest with the players. And I think that that's something that most front offices just aren't. And the tendency is to just treat players like chattel and to not involve them in anything and to be robotic and to not be human. And while people accuse me of that, I actually, with these guys and with many other of our players, I just wanted you guys always to know where you stood and where we stood, and that we always knew that there was business and then there was personal.
So this is where I need to mention that this is going to be an episode about the insanely personal business of Major League Baseball, as revealed through the arcane ritual of a thing known as salary arbitration, which is happening across the sport right now, even during Super Bowl week, as we speak. And if the term salary arbitration sounds boring to you, I get it, because I used to think that way too. But then I found out that the NFL and the NBA refuse to operate the way Major League Baseball does. And for good reason, it turns out. Because when a baseball team and an arbitration-eligible player disagree on what sort of a raise that player deserves, the sport does something truly mind-blowing. They put that team and that player in the same room before a tribunal of judges, and they close the doors. At which point, everyone proceeds to argue before said judges about how much that player sucks. In front of that player. Now, everything that's said is kept off the record, obviously, completely secret. And in fact, salary arbitration is so infamous for poisoning work relationships headed into spring training that some franchises in baseball will simply pay a premium in order to avoid ever having to go through this mess at all. Luckily, however, I found the one team president who apparently cannot wait to talk about that mess. And the same is true of his journeyman outfielder, Cody Ross, and his all-star second baseman, Dan Uggla. What was at stake for you, Dan? Again, I know you as the guy on my fantasy baseball team, power hitter, guy hitting 30 home runs. And then in 2009, what's at stake for you ahead of arbitration as you remember it?
I was actually on the verge of possibly setting the record for the most money ever in arbitration received by, I don't know if it was like all players or just second baseman. I can't remember. But I know that was
It was old white power hitters.
Because
An elite club.
Very elite.
right. So I think Dave. So I think that mark was set at like 5.5 or somewhere right around there, and I think David. I believe you guys were around 4.2, 4.1, and
it was. Hold on. It's funny. It's funny that you guys are so rich that I need to clarify the hundreds of thousands of difference here. 5.35 was what Dan wanted. 4.4 in millions we're talking about is what our friend David was willing to pay you.
That's right. So that's a pretty big difference,
So you're
right?
at 4.4 if you lose. Just if you lose arbitration, the player gets what the team is offering, which would have been $4.4 million. And if you win, Dan would get 5.35. There's no middle. There's no splitting the baby. The arbitrators either choose to side with the player or the team.
Right.
And by getting to that point, we obviously there's a big gap between negotiations and that we couldn't come to. So that's how you end up in the room.
Right. But Cody, this is to say that this is a process that happens because of a fundamental disagreement about how good you are, how much you are actually worth.
Oh,
Right.
Yeah, it's a better way to put it. Yeah.
That's correct. Yes. And I'll remember mine very vividly. Although I don't remember the actual numbers, you could probably tell me the numbers, Pablo.
It was a comically smaller difference than what Dan was dealing with. Dan, again, we're talking about a difference of about $1 million. In Cody's case, we're talking about you were asking for 4.45. David was offering 4.2.
And so, and this is what happens is
Just classic Samson.
well, no, this is what happens with Marlins, I think, were the first team to start this file and trial deal. So if you filed a number, there was no negotiating between the time you filed and the time your arbitration hearing. So there was a deadline. I remember, I'll never forget, my agent was calling me at the witching hour going, hey, they're not budging. And I'm like, well, I'm not budging either. And so we'll just go to arbitration. And so hung up, and sure enough, the time came, and I'm like, let's see if they budge. You think David's budging? Hell no. He ain't budging. And so he texts me or called me the next day. He's like, you idiot. Now we got to go to arbitration in Florida. Oh, gosh, this is going to be painful. Like, just wait and see how much we're going to talk about you. You're going down. I'll never forget it. To finish my story, I'll never forget, I fly into Jupiter for spring training, and our arbitration cases in Tampa. And David calls me, and he's like, hey, I'm taking my family to Tampa, and do you want to jump on the jet with us to go to your arbitration case? So I'm like, yeah. And so my wife and I get on the private jet. But meanwhile, it's probably costs more to fly there than on a private jet than what I'm actually going to either win or lose in arbitration. And so we get on the jet, we get there, we're, cutting it up, having a good time, going to the room. And even though I put up a good year going into that year, like, they bring out some of the craziest stats you've ever seen in your life of like how bad you are. And compared to, some guy from 1973, like, what? How do I compare to that guy?
Typically, in the case of, for instance, the Giants, right? They had a policy that I was reading about, and they were like undefeated in arbitrations for 2 decades, apparently. But the president of baseball ops for the Giants, he did not want to be in the room for arbitrations because it was reported it would help better preserve the clubhouse team spirit. To not have the guy you'd have to see every day be the guy who was telling you, by the way, you're worse than you think you are. And so I just want to set the scene of, like, David, it feels like a courtroom drama, and also maybe a reality show, and also maybe a game show of some sort. Like, can you set the scene for what the this is?
So the scene is this, that when a player has between 3 and 6 years of service time, after 6 years, you're a free agent. For the first 3 years, the team has the unilateral right to decide the salary of the player as long as it's at the minimum or above. But in the middle 3 years, the player and the team have to agree. And if they can't agree on a number, they're not free agents. They can't go to another team, but you then go to 3 independent arbitrators who have to decide the salary. And what you do is you go into a room, a literal room with a rectangular table. And I couldn't disagree more with the Giants president of baseball ops. I think he's a wussy. You've got to be willing to go face your players, and you've got to be honest. And so I didn't go to arbitration with just Dan and Cody. We went often with players, some of whom we never even met until the arbitration room because we had just traded for them. Kevin Gregg, guys, I met in the arbitration room. Redmond, I met in the arbitration room.
Your first impression.
Hey, good to meet you. You suck. That's literally how the relationship started. Yep. And our job is to explain to arbitrators why what the player wants is not reasonable. And you use what are called comps. You find players who have stats that are similar with numbers and salaries that are similar to what you want to pay. And the player gives different players and explains why they should be like those players. And the arbitrator decides.
So I want to ask Dan, your emotional state heading into this, your dress code heading into this. I don't know baseball players to be guys who love wearing suits as a comfort zone.
I didn't sign for a lot of money. I signed for $40,000 out of college. And so the league minimum, once I got to the big leagues, was my first kind of like situation with decent money, right? So now I'm about to become a millionaire. It's either going to be 4.4, you said, or over 5 million. So I'm excited either way, right? I'm excited either way. You're wearing your best suit. You're like, you're prepared. You're like, I set some records going in. So I'm pretty cocky. I'm like, man, these got no chance. Gonna embarrass them, right? My agents are like pumping me up, and then we go in, and then they present their case, and I'm like, oh shit.
I stink.
I'm not as good. I'm not as good as I thought I was.
Like Dan, I mean, I'm coming from basically nothing. And we're talking about a few $100,000. Yeah. So basically you're in a hotel conference room, and it's like David said, a long rectangular table. On that side of the table is your team that you're playing for, and the commissioner's office has a couple of attorneys, and then over here is the arbiters. On my side, I have my agents, attorneys, MLBPA attorneys, and then so I'm sitting closest to the arbiters, and I see David over there. I think was Beinfest there? I can't remember.
Yep.
Was Beinfest there?
Yes.
Yep. And I just was looking at them the whole time. David's got his little smile, and he's like smirking at me, and I'm like smirking at him. And meanwhile, my agents are like, "Hey, you can't when they're talking about you, when we're talking about you, you just you're literally like in a courtroom." But I just wanted to go in and hear what they had to say, because I felt like even that was going to make me better going into the following year.
Wait, that seems so unrelatable to me.
Yeah, I wanted it. I wanted the smoke. I heard all these horror stories about, people going into arbitration and, creating bad tension and bad blood going into the season. You could have a bad taste in your mouth for the organization, but I really didn't, even though they hammered me, which was amazing. At the same time, I'm like, wow, where do they get this shit? This is incredible. Like, they pull stuff literally out of there. It was a tough process to go through, but at the end of it, it was I would do it over 100 times.
Cody, let me remind you of a little nugget that you're forgetting, which is you negotiate with the player right up into the deadline, and you don't know what the player's going to file at, and the player doesn't know what the team's going to file at, because you exchange numbers right at a deadline. Correct. Do you know that Cody Ross filed at a number below his last offer to us? Cody, I don't know if you remember this, but this was the only time in my career, and it made me insane, because not only did we go to the room over $250,000, but when you filed at 445, you wouldn't go below 45 based on comps of ghosts. And we were like, if this guy files at that number, he loses. And then he goes in and files at a number he can win at. And when he filed at 445, I remember like it was yesterday, he filed smartly, knowing that we're a file-to-go team, so we're not going to negotiate with him, and he has to file a number that he can actually support.
Which you didn't realize that Cody Ross was just there for the experience. He just wanted to ride the ride.
He told me that after, and I almost broke up with him. Because you said that to me, Cody, but I remember he's the only player who ever said that to me.
Well, just to, again, state the obvious maybe. It never is the case that the player is there to hear this, except for inside of this room. They never get the unvarnished thoughts. And I also want to just establish that when you walk into the room, there are these three arbitrators there, right? A panel that has been, I guess, decided by both the league and the union in concert. Mm-hmm. Cody, do you remember anything about your arbitrators?
I do not, actually. I couldn't pick them out of a group of two, any three of them. I have no idea. I wasn't focused really on them.
You don't remember a gentleman named James Oldham from Georgetown Law, who is a researcher of English legal history in London in his spare time? He had written a book called The Mansfield Manuscripts and the Growth of English Law in the 18th Century.
It's even now a little shocking when people ask me how long I've been on the Georgetown Law faculty, and I answer, well, in truth, a half a century.
That was one of the arbitrators.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly came in knowing nothing. I don't think my agents knew anything about the arbitrators other than that they're supposed to be neutral.
The arbitrators don't talk during the arbitration. They don't ask questions. They just sit there and listen, and they don't give a written opinion at the end. All they do is rule in favor of the team or the player. You don't know why. You don't know whether it was a 2-1 or 3-0 vote. You only know the result. So there's zero accountability, which is why possession arrow is an important part of the arbitration system, where if the players have won 8 in a row that particular year, the team is going to win the next one no matter what.
Wait. Just to clarify what that is, what you're saying is that there are decisions rendered that are not on the merits of this specific case.
They won't admit it, but it's true. It's 100 guys. I don't know if your union told you that, but possession arrow in baseball arbitration is a real thing.
Yeah, my agent told me that, actually.
So just to, again, clarify that, it's the idea that these arbitrators are agreed upon by the union and the league. So to keep doing this job
Otherwise
of
they get fired.
arbitrating, they need to be satisfying both sides.
That's exactly right. They will, because at the end of every arbitration year, the players' union can point to a name and say, I don't want this person involved next year, and the league can't do anything about it. That person's removed. The league can do the same thing. In order to get appointed year after year, you have to have satisfied both sides, and to do that, you have to give wins to both sides.
And possession error is just a term of art. It's obviously a basketball term.
It alternates, so you know that if it's been 5 league wins in a row, the player's going to get the next one.
Dan, just remind me, beforehand, what did you heard from other people? Like, what's the reputation of this whole process, this whole ritual, before you actually got to experience it?
Well, you always hear kind of like you can't like be friends with these people. They're gonna talk trash about you and they're gonna mean it and all this kind of stuff. So it's like it wasn't the best. It wasn't the best advice from. Dude, I know. It's like, it's so stupid.
Holding his iPhone.
I'm holding wires out of the way. I'm in this horrible spot. The sun's coming in on me. My phone's dying. Can't find my AirPods, you know?
This is Dan Uggla.
This is Dan. This is Dan.
So after I get done here, y'all need to talk about 5 minutes while I charge it because I got to unplug my So anyways.
He's being serious.
Oh, I'm dead serious.
I like that we're going on a tour of what appears to be the largest house in the world.
Oh gosh,
it is. It is.
I wish. Don't mind the 2.6 right there.
Dan's carrying his phone through his estate.
He does have a beautiful house and a beautiful family.
Where are you going, bro?
I'm going down to show him your jersey right there. Come on.
Oh, there it is. Nice. Love it.
So I'm getting out of the sun.
Dan has settled his phone at yet another wing of the estate.
So yeah,
passed by the jerseys. Yeah.
Back to what we were saying.
He just walked 15,000 square feet away to his basement. That basement's amazing. Y'all should go check it out sometime.
It's a good one.
When you enter the room, is there basically the clock already ticking? Because these are how many cases a day in some circumstances?
You have morning cases, 9 a.m. cases, and 2 p.m. cases. And generally, arbitrators will hear 1 or 2 cases or 3 during the course of a session in Tampa or in Arizona. It switches off. And it's just funny because I remember Dan's arbitration. We were arguing about a lot of money. And it was a tough one because, Dan, you had great bulk. And I'm sure
what does that mean?
Great bulk is when you go into arbitration, you've got a lot of stats. You have a lot of home runs, a lot of runs batted in. You've played a lot of games. So you are able to say that, look, I have performed. He was an all-star. I'm sure you remember this, Dan, but you were a pre-arbitration all-star, which also counts for money.
Twice.
Which is why we offered him what we thought was more than we needed to at 4-4. And he was able to call on players, of the the Cabrera ilk practically because of what his numbers were, Pujols and all sorts of people who we said you're not even close to. And we were wrong. Arbitration is a manifestation of the ultimate breaking down of an athlete trying to break his will, his confidence by showing that he's something that he doesn't want to believe he is. There's a reason why the manager is not part of any arbitration hearings and the front office is. There's a reason why certain front office people don't want to be involved,
right?
Because they can't skate the other side.
Well, yeah, just how do you, I want to get in the mind of David Samson trying to throw haymakers to take down the incredible bulk.
Yeah, that's what you do. You try to excuse it. We talked about the fact, do you remember, guys, that we would have to mention that the Marlins always were last in the league in attendance and that we had no revenue.
You blamed them?
That's what we would do. If you guys were better, we'd have more fans.
Amazing.
If you guys were
pulled out
better,
all the stops.
If you guys were better, we'd have more fans. I thought that was a good one.
It's the only moment in which David Samson regretted personally inflating and lying about attendance numbers.
We would actually, in the arbitration, say that. we would say that don't look at our attendance that's announced, and we would go through what our real attendance was. We would admit that in the arbitration because it's all confidential.
You said that they shouldn't trust those numbers because you are dishonest.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Cody, do you remember a moment when you were like, oh, that punch that David threw was a little bit harder than I was ready for?
I just remember like certain stats that they threw out, and I was like, oh man, like that is below the belt. Like I think they were trying to pin me on me not being a starter because I wasn't a starter when I got to the Marlins. I worked my way into being a starter. I was a platoon player. Somebody would get hurt. I would play 30 games in a row, and then the guy would come back and I would kind of platoon. And so going into arbitration, about 3 years in, I've only been a starter for a year and a half. So they were pounding the arbitration guys like, this guy's not a starter. He doesn't, you can't look at him as a starter. Even though I came in on my platform year, having a really good year, they were just pounding like, he's not a starter. He's not a starter. And I'm like, okay, I get it. I am a starter, but you're telling me I'm not. Now they don't think I am a starter.
Well, our argument was that you can't compare him to starters because he was only a circumstance starter. And we didn't want the arbitrators to believe that we viewed him as anything other than a bench player who could be a good fill-in on a bad team.
and also
That's a good point.
And also I got thrown in when I was really young, or not really young, but I came in as a center fielder in professional baseball. And so my agents were like, he's a center fielder. So they were comparing me to all the center fielders, and David and them were like, he's not a center fielder. We only put him there because we had to put him there.
At this point, if I'm Cody Ross, I'm resolving to not be friends with David Samson anymore.
No, I don't think that that's true, Pablo. I think that I was communicative with the players who we went to arbitration with, and we would explain the process. So when both sides view it that way, there's not animosity.
Like you hear horror stories and you learn pretty quick that like, all right, am I going to be tough? Is this going to bother me? You realize it's part of the business. Your first instinct is to be like, oh man, F these guys. I can't believe they're not paying me. I deserve all this. All pour it on, And that just wasn't our relationship. I think has a lot to do with, David just, being straight up with us. And I would tell all the players that are going to go through it, that haven't been through it, is like, embrace it, enjoy it. It's part of it. It means you're good that you're going through this.
I would say like, when you ask me like, why would you want to throw a punch at David? I would say no, because a lot of what they said, like you can't deny some of the stuff that they said. So I'm like, man, even though that hurt, there's a lot of truth in that. Like I can see where they would come and try to bring that case and try to make me look like a certain player.
I was actually pretty, I was like, holy shit, they're comparing me to this guy? Oh man, that's cool. And they're like telling me that I never got an MVP vote and this guy has. I'm like, that means I should have got an MVP vote, I got screwed in that.
You were honored by not being Albert Pujols.
Yeah, it's like, I was never supposed to be there in the first place. It just so happens.
You're Marcus Giles, bro.
That's right.
Marcus Giles.
Yeah. 2.0. Marcus 2.0, baby.
That is something. I think that it's also important to know that it's really hard to get to arbitration. The majority of baseball players, first of all, you never make it to the big leagues. And if you make it to the big leagues, the overwhelming majority don't get 3 years of service. They don't get an opportunity to get into this system. And I think Dan and Cody are two examples of players who understood that. And there's some players who just don't get that.
I want to know, David, we've created a summit here of people who are shockingly reasonable about a very contentious courtroom drama. What's it like when it's not quite as simpatico?
So I can only tell you in all the times I went to the room, I was able to, because of being honest, I was able to disarm the players. The difficult part is when you go with the player you don't know, and then you just have to build a relationship from a 1st and 20, from a negative spot. And that was the case. Do you guys remember Kevin Gregg at all?
Oh, yeah. I got a Kevin Gregg story. So when Kevin went from the Marlins to the Cubs, we played him in Florida. Dan hit a home run off of him to tie the game in the 9th, and I came up right after and hit a home run to win.
Oh, yeah.
Remember
That's right. I didn't even see it because I was still high-fiving. I was like,
back to back. Kevin Gregg, 2 Gs.
Cody Ross, left field. That one's deep. That one's over. Walk off. Cody Ross, just like that. Back to back.
Boom, boom. Kevin Gregg.
I just like that somewhere Kevin Gregg's like, what the fuck, man? I'm just like at home hanging out. Suddenly I'm dragged into
Listen,
this.
he had a career, but when we acquired him, he would not settle, and he was a bastard, and his agents were about it. And we said, no problem. We'll go right to the room with you. Good to meet you. And he's a very tall, Kevin Gregg. Do you remember? Like, he's a big man.
6'6".
Yeah.
6'6",
and he's also,
245.
he has this menacing look. Cody and Dan look jolly, and they are. Kevin Gregg is not what I would call a jolly guy.
He's a reliever, right? That's his whole job is to intimidate.
He is intimidating. Remember, he had those glasses like that he would wear that you never knew whether they were prescription. And he happens to be a great guy, but didn't know this at the time.
You called him a bastard like 30 seconds ago.
Because I didn't know him, and he would not settle after the trade, and he said, and his agent said, we will not budge. And we were like, we're going to the room, and the agent said, you're going to acquire a player and then go right to the room without ever knowing him.
The room.
And that's what we call it, the room. And I said, I'm not scared at all. And so Kevin comes in and
You're saying I was born in the room, raised by the room.
Like, listen, don't threaten me with that. And so, but then after that, when I introduced myself to him outside of the room, when we went back to spring training, we built this relationship that was built on a mutual respect and honesty. And he was a very talented guy. But that was a tough arbitration because we were explaining why we shouldn't have traded for a guy. We basically were saying, I can't believe how dumb we were to acquire someone who's this bad, that we shouldn't be paying him any amount of money. And he didn't know me at all. And he was hearing us say this. It was a tough one.
So the room that you're describing, you're talking about a player that you acquired where you're now saying, oh, this is a mistake. If you're trying to trade that guy to someone else, though, you're saying the opposite.
You're saying how great he is. Yeah, the room, it's an interesting place. And I think Dan and Cody would agree, where it's like Vegas, where what happens in the room is supposed to stay in the room. And you're supposed to take it as its own entity. And some players are better at it than others. These two guys are amazing at it, but not all the players were. There's ego involved. We don't want to lose a case. We don't want the arbitrators to believe that players are worth more than we thought because we do it for a living.
How does this whole thing end? So are there closing arguments?
Mm-hmm. Each side closes, and they say to the arbitrator, the final word from each side is, so I hope that you will see from the evidence presented that Dan Uggla is worthy of $4.4 million, and that you will rule in favor of the club. And the player ends with, I hope that you will see from the evidence that Dan Uggla is worth $5.35 million, and you will rule in favor of the player. There's a thank you. You shake hands. You leave. And then you go back. You literally go back to spring training immediately because there's workouts. Arbitration, generally, many of the hearings happen during spring training, and you have to get back for spring training.
And does the rest of the team like, so how'd it go? Like, what's it like in the clubhouse?
Well, you find out either that day or the next day, right, David?
Next
I remember
day.
It's really fast.
All right, so it is decision time. We kept you waiting outside this room for the verdict long enough, and I just need to point out here, in total fairness before we proceed, that while a pitcher may not want to challenge Dan Uggla or Cody Ross, as Kevin Gregg discovered, arbitration is where you would not want to challenge David Samson, a financially savvy, detail-obsessed team president with a law degree who professionally haggles over contracts for a living. As he said earlier, in the room, David Samson is wildly intimidating in his own right. which is why it is especially hilarious to me that David Samson's official record in the room against Cody Ross and Dan Uggla is 0-2. Do you remember the moment, the scene of how you found out that you won?
It was early in the morning, and we, I was up at 7:30 in the morning, couldn't sleep. And I think we got the phone call somewhere around like 8:30, 9 o'clock. It was quick. It was early. And they said, we have ruled in your favor. And it was just like, like an explosion. It was like jumped up, 5-year-old kid in me was jumping on the bed, screaming and yelling. All my agents and everybody come running in. We had like 8 people in the house. We're all like on the bed, jumping together, like, ah, popping champagne. And I was like,
I'm disgusted.
it was party time, man. It was great.
Mine was a little different. I remember I was obviously in Florida the next day, and my agent called me before I actually went into spring training, and he was like, great news, we won, blah, blah, blah. And I'll never forget it because I remember thinking, wow, I'm a multimillionaire now. I just got $4.5 million. I can tell people I'm a multimillionaire. So that was kind of my thought process behind it.
And look, I can't tell you for certain that Cody and Dan would be quite so eager to relive all of this with me on camera 15 or so years later if, in fact, they had lost to their employer in the room. But what remains clear to me is that the guy who lost, David Samson, absolutely is.
So, yeah, by the time you get back to spring training the next day, you already know that you won. And, when you win, it's nice because you can walk around the clubhouse and be like, I just kicked their ass. Yeah, we won. So it's kind of and then, you see the front office in the clubhouse the next day and you walk by like, what's up, guys?
I remember that clearly, going into the clubhouse after a loss.
Yeah, what's it like for David Samson to walk around the clubhouse having lost in the world of one-on-one business?
Yeah, you just feel as though that the other players are seeing a weakness and that they're going to use that when it's their turn for arbitration. And so I didn't want to lose any of the cases at all. But I do remember making it a point to be in the clubhouse the next day to make sure that all the players saw, and including Dan and Cody, that win or lose, we're teammates and we are on the same side. And what arbitration does is it forces you to be enemies for that period of 5 hours. And if you do it with aplomb, you can get through it. And some players and some teams just can't get through it. Guys, there are teams that will not go to arbitration. And players know that. And you can take advantage of that.
To avoid all of the awkwardness,
Correct.
the tension, the infighting.
The Yankees are famous. They don't want to go to arbitration. They feel as though that is beneath them to have to argue against a player. And it ends up hurting them because players take advantage of that fact and can get higher salaries.
It hurts the Yankees and it hurts the other teams too, because then the other teams have to negotiate on the behalf of the Yankees. And the Yankees are just handing money out. Or for the teams like the Marlins, they're trying to save every penny they possibly can. So it creates this kind of distance between teams too.
And we never wanted the union to be able to use a win. Like Dan Uggla's win cost the industry so much more so than your win, Cody, just because of where Dan was in his career.
It moved the market.
Yeah, 100%, because then everyone who wanted to compare themselves to Dan Uggla, they were comparing themselves to a 5.35 number instead of a 4.4 number. It's really actually a big deal, and players should be thanking you, Uggs. I don't know if you get payments from them, but there are a bunch of players who came after you who got paid a hell of a lot more than they would have had you lost that case.
Right.
Your pre-arbitration years were some of the best in the history of baseball.
Oh my gosh, you guys are making me blush over here. Making me blush. I'm not used to all the flowers. Thank you.
But the ultimate compliment is David Samson saying that true clutchness is when you're great before I got to pay you more.
Well, these guys know my mantra. You have to have players outperform their contracts if you're going to have a winning team. And that's true of the Yankees, the Giants, the Braves, or the Marlins. Every team needs that or you're not going to win.
How much were you guys watching the faces of the arbitrators? Because there's suspense in the room. What's the tension like?
The league and the union hate each other. So the representatives of the league and the representatives of the union, I don't know who you guys had. Was it Michael Weiner? I don't know what year.
Weiner.
It could have been Weiner, who was, rest in peace, he died young.
Yes.
But he was very difficult in the room. And it was
amazing.
him. He's a great, great litigator.
Beloved by the players.
Because what he did for those players, it's just incredible. He advocated in a way that, would make Donald Fear blush. But what Weiner did in the room was try to get the arbitrators' attention by saying how greedy and how bad the teams are in the league, looking for arbitrators to give any sort of indication that they were listening or agreeing. My experience was I didn't really pay attention to the arbitrators because I knew they were going to take the cases, and after the oral arguments, they go into a room and just sort of decide, and there was nothing I could read from it. I don't know if you guys found differently.
Well, you get coached up on it by your agents to, how to act, what to do, what not to do. And, you're just super polite when you walk in the room. I don't remember if we shook hands before, if we shook hands. I knew we shook hands after with the arbiters, but I remember just like, trying to give them that cute little smile that I have, win a couple points.
Winking and shooting finger
Seriously?
guns? That's what you're doing?
Like, that's going to work? You were going to charm them?
It works. Trust me.
I can't even. Cody, I loathe you. I really do. Stands in front of the arbitrators trying to woo them with his $1 million smile, and he never wore a mouth guard.
That's right.
So what did going through this experience do for your guys' relationship?
There was such a foundation of friendship, business relationship, just knowing each other past baseball, knowing each other's families and everything that, we're having pizza in New York at 4 a.m. some nights. And there's no what are you doing? Or everybody's trying to hide from the other. It's we're all in there being people together, and we had built that foundation. Honestly, I mean, I guess it could have made us a little stronger when we got through it, because anytime you go through something like that and you're still friends or whatever, it makes you strong. But we were already so strong.
I think for me, the reason why there was no sort of animosity or hate or I think obviously I have to give a ton of credit to David, even though I don't like to. I'm going to give him a ton of credit. He was so good about coming back on the team plane, hanging out with us, playing poker, having a couple drinks with us on the back of the plane, talking shit. Just so much fun just to be around. And then when it came time to do business, he was completely honest with us, whether we were good or bad. And that is exactly what you want as a player. You don't ever really get that. You don't get the personal usually, and you don't get the honesty secondly. And that's what made him so amazing.
As I'm watching David genuinely be warmed by your warmth, by your friendship, I do want to point out the aftermath of this whole thing, which is that arbitration, of course, comes and goes. They both win. David Samson loses. But then, in the case of Dan Uggla, Dan, you're gone. You leave the Marlins by 2011. And Cody Ross, that next season, you're out of there.
It got way too expensive.
This has been Pablo Torre Finds Out, a Meadowlark Media production. And I'll talk to you next time.